Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Leap In Presents. Today, we're talking about autism and the NDIS. My name's Dee, and I'm the Learning and Development Specialist here at Leap In. And today, I'm going to be talking to you about autism and the NDIS. So, hopefully, today will be a really insightful session for you. Firstly, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we work and live, acknowledging the stories, traditions, and living cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on this land, and committing to building a brighter future together. Things in terms of housekeeping. So I am here from Leap In. I've also got one of my teammates, Christy Lee, is also here to answer any questions. Leap In is a plan manager in the NDIS. We're not the NDI ourselves. So sometimes people might come to our Leap In Presents and they might ask really specific questions. So in our audience today, we've got lots of people here that include NDIS participants and family members. We will have providers as well as support coordinators. So if you have a question that really is specific to your circumstances, we always do recommend that you ask the NDIA directly. The reason why I'm really excited to talk to you about autism, the NDIS, is I myself identify as a neurodivergent person, and I have people in my life that are autistic, and something that it's really incredibly important to listen to our community. And there is some words that I'm going to share right now and some phrases. So something that we often will talk about in our community is if you've met one individual with autism, you've met one individual with autism. We're all very different people. You'll hear me use identity first language. This is again something that is embraced within our community, and it recognises that autism is part of our identity, so it can't necessarily be separated. So different people with different disabilities might refer to their disabilities in a different framing. This visual really summarises to me that identity first language. So it's moving away from sort of negative word like suffering from, and we're not sort of with autism, so we don't refer to other disabilities like as a person with blindness or a person with deafness. So being autistic is inherent in our identity. So you might be thinking, I've already said that I myself am neurodivergent. So there's a phrase that I'm referring to around neurodiversity. So neurodiversity was coined by an Australian sociologist, Judy Singer, back in 98. And it really looked at the social view of disability, saying that, most brains are typical and they might be considered neurotypical, but some brains are diverse or different, and they therefore would be neurodiverse. So this is absolutely supported by our community as a way of just marking difference. Now, there is an approach that we utilise, which is really what we call neuroaffirming, neurodivergent affirming. And it's around looking at strengths versus deficits. So it's not around what we necessarily can't do. So differences are natural to be supported and embraced, and allows people to understand their needs and learn to advocate for support and their individual circumstances. Now I'm just going to jump in and share a couple of videos because I always do enjoy sharing some stories from our community. So let's listen. This first particular one is one of the first stories that I would normally look at if somebody's received an autism diagnosis as a means of explaining, particularly if they're looking to explain, for example, to a child as well.
Some differences are easy to see. Height, hairstyle, gender, eye colour, and so on. Other differences can't be seen. Our favourite foods, fears, or special skills. Interestingly, the way we see the world is also different. For instance, what do you see in this drawing? Most people see a duck, but some of you might have seen a rabbit. Whichever you saw, you are correct. This is just a trick drawing to show you that all brains work differently. The brain is your body's computer. It works differently for all of us and controls how you learn. That's why we are all good at different things. How you feel, which is why we all feel different emotions. And how you communicate. Sometimes the brain is connected in such a way it affects the senses and how we perceive and read situations and interactions. This is known as autism. Many people have autism, so it's likely you already know someone who is autistic. And for this reason, it's useful to know a little bit about autism. The special wiring inside an autistic brain can sometimes make the person good at tasks we may find difficult, such as mathematics, drawing, or music. It can also do the opposite, and activities we find too easy are incredibly difficult to them, such as making friends. The senses constantly send information to your brain about your surroundings and other people. However, when a person's brain and its senses don't communicate well, the brain can become overwhelmed and confused, affecting how they see the world. Picture yourself walking down the street. This is how an autistic brain may experience the same world. Scary, isn't it? Sadly, in many cases, the person can't say out loud how they feel. So even though there's chaos going on in their heads, they seem okay on the outside, unable to ask for help. We will develop behaviors to help us feel calm in uncomfortable situations. We may look away, hug ourselves, chew our fingernails, fidget, bite our lips, and so on. Equally, autistic people develop behaviors that help them cope with these intense moments. These actions may seem unusual, but they're just their way to feel calm. When they happen, it means they are having a hard time. The kind thing to do is not to give them an even harder time by getting cross, ignoring them, or mocking them. People with autism need friends who are willing to take the time to know them. With good communication and plenty of patience, everyone would be better off. People with autism are not ill or broken. They simply have a unique view of the world. And with a little support from their friends, they might just be able to share that view with us. Autism can make amazing things happen.
So now I'm going to talk to you about how autism sits alongside the NDIS and what sort of typical supports we look at. So when we take a step back and think about what is the NDIS is considered a new way of providing community, linking individualized support for people with permanent and significant disability to their family and carers. So that's all come from the NDIS page. We hear about words such as choice and control, and a whole-of-life approach to the support that people need to live more independently and work towards their goals. And that might look at, for example, somebody's needs who are particularly in that early childhood stage might need different things when they are later on in life as well. So someone who's an adult would have different needs, different support needs, and different services that they'd be accessing. Now, when we think about people with disability, the current figures in terms of people in Australia who have disability represents about 4.4 million. So it's 1 in 6 people. And if you were to think about how many people are with us, you know that there's disabilities such as autism, which is what we refer to as an invisible disability. We can't necessarily see that someone's autistic from the outside as well. Now, there is a difference in how many people have a disability, and that's the figure of NDIS participants. So there's presently, as of December, 646,449 participants. So you can see there's a big difference. Not everyone who has a disability is able to access the NDIS, and I will expand on how that impacts autistic people. So we know that the NDIS has been here for about 10 years now. There were supports prior to the NDIS, and I'm aware that we are in a changing space where we hear our Minister Shorten talking about what future NDIS could look like. A lot of the information that our Minister is sharing is still yet to come through as part of the new legislation and new acts of Parliament. Change could be coming. But what we saw before the NDIS is that there were all state-based and regional supports, and they existed with really limited scope. Your funding went to one organisation. You didn't have a choice necessarily of where you went to access that support. So if I was in Queensland and I was autistic, I would be working with Autism Queensland. And if I moved to New South Wales or South Australia, I had to reapply. I had to go and show again that I was autistic, that I was disabled to a new organisation. So I didn't really have a say in who I dealt with. There were usually one organisation per state, and it was a little bit disjointed. So there was what they called the Helping Children with Autism grant, and that was an amount of $12,000 that used to be granted to eligible children for 2 years. So it was a different system. Completely different system from what we have now with the NDIS. Now, I'm going to share some data, and some of this might be a little bit new for you. So in terms of who is represented in the NDIS, and the NDIS refers to what they call as a primary disability. So people can have multiple disabilities. They can have multiple co-occurring disabilities, but presently you would apply under your primary disability. So that represents 36% of all NDIS participants. Now, when we look a little bit closer, we often hear, and I know that some people have indicated that they've got autistic children in their life, that represents, for NDIS participants that are under 15, that represents 52%. So more than half of the NDIS participants that are under 15 are autistic. And further in that information, in that data, we find that 69% of all autistic participants identify as male. So I want to sort of talk about that point for a minute, that autism isn't exclusively male and it's not under 15. So there's many things that are up. In terms of being diagnosed, we see diagnosis as a community sort of starts happening from about ages 5 onwards, because to actually go through that diagnosis, you're looking at milestones, developmental milestones not being met. So before you can say that somebody has impacts to their speech or their communication, we essentially need to wait for typical milestones to happen and see those gone. So for some people as well, not only are we waiting for developmental milestones, but some people, it might be that when they go to school, that all of a sudden that it becomes very apparent that someone might have different support needs from typical peers, that they might have sensory impacts to school, they might find social interactions challenging, their communication might be different. So it can be school that typically will see a parent or a caregiver start that conversation that something might be happening, and they might look at a diagnosis. Now, diagnosis takes time. It takes time and it costs a fair amount of money. I can talk personally. I've undergone this process with my own children as well. So you're either looking at costing what could be in some circumstances thousands of dollars, or you're looking at time if you're looking to access other supports via community and other public means. The one on the end is a really big one. So that's the masking impact. So our autistic girls and our autistic women, you might have heard a phrase such as masking. So we very quickly in our lives learn to understand how people interact, and we assume those behaviours. So essentially you can imagine that an autistic girl might present as typical on the outside, and it's only when they're in their safe place, when they're at home potentially, that challenges are felt. And it might take years for some people to become aware that they are in fact autistic, and you'll see a lot of information emerging in this. And I've got some resources as well at the end I'm going to share, that girls are not so easy to diagnose. So the original criteria around diagnosis was around boys, and it does require different understanding and nuance to understand what an autistic girl may present. Now, when I talk about access, I'm going to move into this topic now. I want everyone to be aware as well that we have an ebook. It's completely free, where we step you through the process of how to access the NDIS. So I'm going to walk through now what the eligibility requirements are. If you haven't yet applied, I know that I saw that some people are yet to apply, you are most welcome to access this guide from our website as well. Now, in terms of autistic children, if your child is under 9, your contact would be via the early childhood partner. If your child is under 7, so 6 and under, there's no diagnosis needed. And typically what you'll see at this point is that funding will be around therapy to help address the child's needs. So, I've mentioned that speech or communication might be impacted. Sometimes, autism's an absolutely, there's a breadth to how it can present. So there could be gross motor or fine motor impacts as well. So therapy will be usually what you'll have in your plans to help address your child's needs. It is important as well that over 7, you will need a diagnosis to continue to receive support from the early childhood partner. So when we talk about accessing the NDIS, once we're over 7, that diagnosis level is really important. It can certainly determine the reports and information that you'll need to present to the NDIS. So if you have an autism level diagnosed of 2 and 3 under the DSM-5, which is the current diagnostic statistical manual, it's considered a list A condition, which means that it's automatically accepted by the NDIS. So your diagnosis letter or report will usually be your supporting evidence that you will provide. If you have autism level 1 or an older diagnosis, there was a DSM-4 prior to 2013. It's considered list B. So usually some more evidence is needed because list B conditions from the NDIS can fluctuate. So usually you would need a functional capacity assessment, and you can obtain those from an OT. We detail all of that information. And I can see that someone's sharing that they've been asked for more information as well. Certainly when they're asking for more evidence, you would be looking at the functional capacity. I will come back at the end as well and step through where you can find that information. Now, if we want to talk about what the average autism funding packages are, there's 2 figures here that I'm showing. I'm showing an average payment for someone that's under 18 and an over 18 payment. Now, we might know people within our own networks or our communities who had different funding packages. So when this is the information that's shared from the NDIS, that on average, someone with a primary diagnosis of autism, if they're under 18, the package might look around 23,000. And for 50,000, it says not in supported independent living. So that's a type of support for someone that needs significant 24-hour care. Usually quite a lot of physical needs are needed. So that's what the not in SIL means. So that's kind of helpful information, I think, to understand, because when we come into the NDS, we don't necessarily know what type of package it could be looked at. And that is usually per plan year. So plans might run, if you have a child, it might be a 12-month plan because children develop differently. For someone who's a little bit older, maybe in their teens, they might be looking at a 2 or a 3-year longer plan period, of which this funding would be allocated per plan year. Ultimately, the NDS is hoping to have longer plans when people's disability is considered more stable, so there's not the big developmental changes. So something to think about is that everyone's NDIS goals are different. You know, I look at all of this imagery and I could think of that for some people that support autistic people, autistic children, it might be around learning tasks of independently getting dressed, not just being able to wear clothing, and there can be sensory impacts to clothing, but tying shoelaces can be really tricky. And in some instances, some people might find alternatives to tasks like that. They might find things that have Velcro or that have easy snaps to sort of help address what they need to be able to get dressed, make good choices. And I say good in terms of weather appropriate. Sometimes they can be Introception, which means that we might be wearing clothes that are a little bit warm or a little bit cool when the weather indicates that we probably need to have something a little bit different. Others, there can be goals around transport. Learning to get around independently is fantastic. Certainly when we are looking at beyond childhood, sort of through to the teens and older, that requires understanding time travel, schedules, buses, trains, logistically, there's tasks to be done, let alone managing money and independent budgeting. And in Queensland, we have a go card, and I know different states have different types of systems. So, learning how to be where you need to be when, and there's a lot of tasks that are part of executive functioning that are really important to break down and work towards. Others might also have goals around, having a meal with friends or going out socially. There can be impacts to fine motor as well. So that could even look at holding some cutlery could be really tricky, let alone when we talk about diets and sensory impacts to diets and the need for safe food that meets someone's sensory needs. So everyone's NDIS goals are different and everyone presents differently. So, thinking about what's important for you is absolutely critical when you're talking about what your goals look like, which help drive your plan. When we look at what the plan funding categories are, Typically, we're looking at two funding categories. So that's capacity building, and I'm going to explain what some of the capacity building supports can look like, as well as core. The other categories that exist in the NDIS include transport or assistive technology, and that's really big assistive technology, over $1,500 plus. So things like wheelchairs or communication devices. So we don't see a lot of those funding categories across most autistic plans because everyone's disability is different as well. So when we talk about capacity building, the one that we see a lot is improved daily living. And what that will typically look like is therapy supports, which can be used to build your independence and skills. And a lot of people we see all the time, they get told that they've got to go to these three, right? That there's OT, psychology, and speech therapy. And sometimes when we go and we're on waiting lists for a long time, look, it can be quite hard because you're thinking, I've got these goals and I've got this planned funding and I want to use it. But there are other therapists as well that you can absolutely utilize. There's a list in what we call the pricing guide. Most plans will have flexibility, which allow you then, so instead of waiting potentially for, on a waiting list for a long period of time, you could be starting to move towards your goals with one of these allied health. There's, exercise physio or physiotherapists are excellent in case, you might have some gross motor issues, or like I said before, there's something called interoception, which is around learning to read your body signals, how that impacts. There can be dietitian, art therapy, social workers. So there's a wide range of therapy supports that are available as well. Other things that could be available for you in improved daily living includes parent training. I haven't yet met any parent that has received a diagnosis for their child and instantly known how to support that disability. So you can access training. That can look like workshops that you might attend either face-to-face. You might even go to online workshops. It's an excellent opportunity for you to learn about how to support your child's needs. Skills development, which can certainly be helpful, particularly as people gain their independent skills. They want to work on things like, transport training or that money management that I talked about as well, and community engagement to help engage and connect with your social community as well. There is other capacity building funding that, depending on your needs, might be funded. And we do have some Leap In Presents that are specifically around those. So if you've got someone in your life that wants to learn about what the NDS supports are around finding work or connecting to other social networks, come along to those Leap In Presents. Improved Life Choices is where that plan management comes from. So if you find that working with Leap In's helpful, that's where your funding is. It's not out of your therapy funding. Support coordination can help connect you to services and supports and help you with reports and applications to the NDS for different technology and supports. Improved learning can help transition you if you're leaving high school and you're needing support to go to other study like university and TAFE. It's not the courses, but I talk about that all in our employment supports and our other Leap In Presents. So depending on your needs, you might find that you've got other capacity building. Now, I also mentioned that core funding is what we will typically see, and this is very flexible funding. So unlike capacity building, where we see rules for each category, your plan will typically have some amount of core funding. So that could be covering a range of things. So a lot of people might look at utilising support workers or accessing community and social participation activities. There's also usually some consumables funding. So, continence might be something that, for example, some children might achieve really later than their peers who would be funded to support those types of needs and things like that as well. I'm just going to check a couple of the questions. I might have to come back at the end as well. Absolutely. So somebody's asked about improved daily living can be flexible within allied health. So when you see a plan, it really does determine, when you look at your plan, the words that determine if something is stated is it will say stated. If you see a plan and it says something like X amount of hours has been allocated for OT or X amount of hours has been allocated for psychology, what you are seeing is the planner's notes. They're explaining how they've made the budget. Unless it says stated, you do have flexibility to reach your goals with other allied health. And if you like, we can always follow up with a conversation and go through that with you. So we have an unpack your plan session. It's completely free. You don't have to be a Leapin member. We'll be able to explain that for you. And the second question that I'm just going to answer now before I go further is capacity building funding flexible within the categories? Or does the category have to be stated? There are 8 categories in capacity building. If you have one of those 8, you can use usually the line items, the items that are in that category. So I'm talking about the pricing arrangement. We can always follow up for you. So we have that service for you, completely free, completely complimentary. We'd have one of our team have a chat to you, so we can do that for you if you'd like as well. A great question has come through as well. Someone's asked, what funding helps pay for diagnostic assessment? I'm going to now jump into the NDIS page. So under NDIS, under understanding the NDIS, we go to NDIS and other government services. Scrolling down here to NDIS and the health system, there's information here about what is the health system responsible for. I hope I'm not going too fast. Assessing and diagnosing disabilities such as autism is deemed as a responsibility from the health system. So when NDIS sees that another government organisation, and in this instance it might be Medicare, would give you a small rebate because it's a diagnosis and it's from the health system, that is where the diagnosis is. So NDIS doesn't pay for the diagnostic assessment, and that's available there. So you usually find that there are health items that can be rebated. So when anyone has a Medicare item, you can't do both. You have one or the other. Thank you very much for asking that question and letting us have the opportunity to show you that resource. So I want to talk now about co-occurring conditions, and I'm going to give you some information around some examples as well. So most people that are autistic have more than one co-occurring condition. I reference always that getting an autism diagnosis is like a suite of luggage. You start off with your one suitcase and then you end up with your carry-on luggage and the other matching pieces. So most people will have something else that's impacting their daily life. And 60% have more than one. So whether it's a co-occurring condition like ADHD, food aversions, sleep disorders really high. Most autistic people will have troubles getting to sleep, staying asleep, sleepwalking, all sorts of sleep things. There can be gastro issues, co-occurring epilepsy and seizures as well. So it's very rare that person just has one condition, being autism. There's often some other things that come along as well. So I have had some questions about how therapists can support your goals as well. So I do have another story as well, which is around occupational therapy. So let me just share.
As a parent, you'll often hear the term OT. An OT is an occupational therapist. The role of an occupational therapist is to work with your child to increase their ability to participate in their everyday activities to the best of their ability. Occupational therapists work in a variety of different settings. You might see occupational therapists in a hospital, there might be an occupational therapist in your early intervention team, you might see a private occupational therapist, or you might see an occupational therapist who works in a group with your speech therapist. So you can really find them in a variety of different settings. And likewise, the therapy is offered in a variety of different settings. So the occupational therapist might work in your home, they might work at the child's kinder or their school or their other learning environments, or they might offer occupational therapy sessions in their clinic. There are 3 main activity types that your occupational therapist will work on with your child: play, self-care, and learning or social experience. Self-care is the child's ability to look after themselves. Some of the things that we target in terms of self-care activities are feeding, toilet training, bathing, dressing. But we also target the way that the family is able to help the child with these activities. There can be lots of reasons why children with autism might have difficulty with self-care tasks. For one child, if we have the example of putting on their shoes and socks, for one child, the part of that task that they might find difficult is coordinating their hands so that they can pull the sock onto their foot, or pulling the Velcro through the loop so that they can do up their shoe. So that's what we call fine motor skills. And that might be one thing that that child has difficulty with. But then you might see another child who's also having difficulties with putting on their shoes and socks, but the reasons that they're having difficulties with that is completely different. They might be having difficulties because the feel of the sock for them isn't, they've got a sensory sensitivity to the feel of the sock. For the child who has a sensory sensitivity to the sock, it might be that you work with the child to sort of build up their tolerance to wearing socks, gradually building it up. Or it might be that you work with the family to find another type of sock that might be more comfortable for the child.
I'm going to sort of stop there as well, but that's just given us some ideas of just one area around self-care that some people might not be aware of, might be experiencing with their autistic child. So now I've got a scenario that I'm going to work through. So this might be an autistic child who might struggle to communicate their needs and might find it really hard to focus and needs to move, but easily tires out in activities. They might find change really hard and they need a lot of support around that. And like I said earlier, parents need to understand their child's disabilities. We all need to understand our disabilities and what our needs are and learn to be able to ask for help and accommodations. So there could be a range of allied therapists that could address those needs. So some people will typically think about speech therapy, but sometimes OTs can also help with that as well, particularly when understanding what some of the gross motor needs are or things that are needed to be put in place as supports to help that child understand what's coming next. If those therapists are one avenue, but like I said, also exercise physiotherapists as well, might also be helpful to understand. And I've seen children that really do have low muscle tone or might be appearing to be floppy or not aware of their body space and how it impacts with others. They might lean on people and things like that. So these are all helpful in understanding how to move your body and do the things that you want to do in your activities. Parent training can be an opportunity as well to explore and assistive technology. And I've got a picture there of like a schedule, because helping develop visual tools and schedules and building routine and communicating these things are really important, can make a big difference in people's lives as well. As we get a little bit older, we could look at an autistic tween who might then have a really limited or restricted diet. Sometimes restricted eating occurs. Wanting to connect to others and make friends are absolutely natural goals at this stage. Wanting to learn to be independent in their day and get around. So they might be working with either an OT or even a specialist dietitian to understand impacts to diet and how they're getting the right nutrition to help them be healthy and meet the needs of their body. Building independence, commonly we'll see things like support workers being utilised. They might even also attend social groups as well. And that's where we usually see that core funding around those important connections that need to be built as well. Lastly, we've got an autistic teen, not a tween, this time presenting as socially isolated and masking in company, struggling with communication at times, and can be situationally mute even, which means, lose their ability to speak. Shutdowns and meltdowns are common. Might be interested in studying after school finishes as well. So exploring different therapies, moving beyond just speech therapy. So things like art therapy could be a wonderful modality to explore communication, learn how to express themselves without relying on talk therapy, particularly if speech is troublesome. As they're looking at studying after school, they might be supported with improved learning. And because they're socially isolated, there might be funding for support in social connections, either via capacity building or through core as well. So you can see that everyone has different needs and their plans might look really different as well. So the last message I want to talk about as well is it's really important to build your village. It's incredibly important to connect to others, whether that's online. So I do a lot of work in Brisbane, in the online Brisbane autistic community. Online, there's Instagram, there's Facebook, there's meetups. There's also wonderful resources from different autistic pages, such as the Autism CRC, Reframing Autism. I talked before about how hard it is with girls and women. Yellow Ladybugs does wonderful work around understanding autistic girls and transgender folk. Gender diverse folk. Autism What Next is also a really helpful resource where you can look at where you're at in your journey and what you need to know, and it'll give you some helpful information. I've got another story I'm going to share right now who can help and who can connect to as well.
Peer support can be found in a lot of different ways. I think for me, mainly peer support was found on social media in terms of dedicated social media groups. There's many autistic women groups. You find autistic women online on Facebook, for example. You can join many of those groups. Most groups are pretty easy to join as long as you just say, like, I'm either suspected or have a diagnosis. And there can be groups dedicated to women specifically as well.
My number one piece of advice for anyone discovering the autism community and seeking a diagnosis, if that's for you, is to seek out meeting other people on the spectrum. So I would highly recommend finding a social group or a support group. I know I have an online social group. We're quite explicit that we're not a support group. We just meet up online and have a chat to each other. Half the time it's about autism related topics, half the time it's not.
When finding your tribe, this is what I like to call it, is it can be incredibly beneficial in getting the support and the understanding more about yourself and more about other people that are out there that are just like you, because it's often quite overwhelming just after getting a diagnosis, and it is also good to be able to talk it through with other people going, yes, I've got this, I've got some understanding, but I also don't feel alone in what I'm going through in this process, because often after diagnosis some people may feel really quite sad, or they may feel angry, or they can feel really relieved and feel really energized. So there can be all sorts of mixed emotions after diagnosis, so it's good to have other people that are also there with you. And finding these people, they can be done through social media, which is quite often, there's lots of different groups out there. There may be local support groups around you.
For me, it's kind of peer support comes in sort of like, a few different ways, like online, offline, and it's just about finding that right group for you. And what the purpose of it, I suppose, is it to get that sort of support that you're not alone? Is it to find information about what you need, about your diagnosis? Is it simply about learning workplace skills or relevant skills to help you in an area? So that's what I find in peer support. You've got to think about what you want out of it too.
When you talk to other people and hear real stories from real people, it puts your own life into perspective. And it's also a great resource for just asking around in your local community. There's not always one best piece of advice for any one person. So when you ask around and you get little tips from other people in a similar situation, they can recommend you groups, they can recommend you organizations, they can say, I had this experience with this person. It just helps you get a sense of what the whole process is like, and knowledge helps with anxiety. If you have no idea what it's going to be like, it can be really big and overwhelming. So talking to other people who have been through the process before is a really great resource.
A lot of the challenges you face in the real world, I suppose, are sort of taken away a little bit in that social media medium for me. So I've just found my experience in that sense was, like when I just leaned really hard into social media, that was how I was able to cope initially with, finding out I was autistic.
Also want to highlight again, these resources are here. Reframing Autism is a wonderful autistic-led charity that has lots of resources. So a question came up, is there an alternative to Yellow Ladybugs? So Yellow Ladybugs exists because girls and gender diverse folk are the minority in terms of diagnosis and information. So most information, most groups, it started that the original diagnostic criteria was around boys. So most information we find, most groups are around boys because the boys are diagnosed and recognised at a much higher rate. So Reframing Autism is one I'd have a look at. Autism What Next? Don't forget as well that even if people have gender assigned at birth, that they might in their journey find that they're a little bit different later on. So that's really common as well. But hopefully today we've shared some insight that has been helpful for you. I'm going to have a look through the questions if there's anything further for you that I can answer. Someone's asked about support groups for parents of adult children. Jumping online to your local area is certainly my recommendation. So if you're in Queensland, you'd be looking at Queensland groups, New South Wales groups, Victoria, I would be looking at local groups. I personally love to be able to go out and connect with people, whether I'm having a coffee or a lunch or a dinner. But for some people, it's really safe or it's accessible to connect online. So find them online and find your community, find others. They'll also suggest other groups for you. In my experience, we're all online these days, just like we are right now. It's really important to build your village and to find others that understand about autistic needs and can also give you some ideas about how you'd traverse your path as well. So that's kind of the complete content that I have.